All right, guys, welcome to Lab 4. What we're going to be going over today is the brain. Maybe you've talked about in lecture, maybe you haven't, but you totally will. So my goal is to go through, talk about all the structures, describe the anatomy. Obviously, in lecture, we're going to be going over the specific functions, um, but you have a list of terms you should be familiar with. And we're going to start off. So the brain, obviously, nervous tissue, composed primarily of neurons. Um, the brain is broken into different regions. So we'll start off. These regions are called lobes. So you have a variety of different lobes located depending on the view. So obviously, if we're looking at the posterior view here, we can see the back. Right? We'll be able to see part of the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. I like starting off with the lateral view down here. And on here, you will see definitively the frontal lobe, which is in the front of the brain, the temporal lobe, which is on the side, the occipital lobe, which is in the back. Probably make that a little bit neater for you there. Um, and the parietal lobe. These are four generalized regions. Each of these regions has its own specific function, and some of them have multiple functions. You will notice that the brain is very wrinkly looking. Um, this is because it is made of folded structures called gyri or a gyrus. A gyrus is a fold or a bump. In between these gyri, we have little, you can call them little cracks, but little spaces. And these little spaces are called sulcus or sulci. And then in between larger regions of the brain, for example, separating the right and the left hemisphere, you have very large spaces called fissures, right? These are three structural components of the brain. And we'll see some of these separating a variety of lobes and other parts. So obviously you have to be familiar with the generalized basic regions of the brain, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. And we'll try to color code this for you here. You have sulcus that separate the different regions. So the first sulcus I'm going to talk about, we could see right here. And this is called the lateral sulcus. You don't have to call it the lateral cerebral sulcus. You totally can. And you can kind of see that separating the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe. We have a very important sulcus that we will dive into called the central sulcus. And this sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. We have a parieto-occipital sulcus, which clearly separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. And the larger separations, if you will, are called fissures. So here we have, looking at kind of the back of the brain, you could also see it from the top, a longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure separates the brain into a right and a left half, if you want to think about it like that. On this view, we can also see the central sulcus. And we have one more fissure that separates the cerebrum, which is the big part of the brain, from some other structures called the hindbrain. So this transverse fissure separates the big top part, if you will, from the brainstem, or in this case, the cerebellum. So we will show you on a couple other pictures, but you should also know what the cerebellum is. It sits on the posterior bottom part of the brain. There's two different components. It controls, balance and things like that. All stuff we'll talk about in lecture. And lastly, on this picture, you see that you have that central sulcus separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobes. There are two important bumps, if you will, called gyri. There is one in the front, which we can kind of see right here, and we can kind of see right here. And this is called the precentral gyrus. It is in front of, so it's called pre, in front of the central sulcus. Thus, we call it the precentral gyrus. This is an extremely important part of your brain that is responsible for controlling your motor movements. Any type of muscle contraction will be initiated from this region of the brain. Very, very important. Voluntary motor control. And the bump on the back, we call the postcentral gyrus. That is also horrible. My apologies. Postcentral gyrus, and that sits behind the central sulcus. And this is the primary area for sensory input. Depending on what type of sensory, somatosensory, a lot of your sensory messages will get sent to this region. As a general understanding, we like to think about the frontal lobe more as movement. There are some other functions. We like to think about the parietal lobe as sensory. We like to think about the occipital lobe as vision. And the temporal lobe has a variety of different functions we'll talk about. And I already mentioned the cerebellum as far as fine-tuning motor control. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through now that we know the basics, and I will label or at least highlight some important components that we should be able to recognize on these models, right? So right off the bat, we can see the cerebellum, right? We can see the different lobes, occipital, parietal, frontal, and temporal. We can see a few sulcus, the central sulcus and the lateral sulcus. The parieto-occipital sulcus is like right back there. You can't really see it that great on here. And we have our pre and post-central gyrus. Pre and post. That's supposed to be an R there. Beautiful. So real quick, parietal, occipital, cerebellum, frontal, temporal, and then you have your two sulcus. So hopefully that makes sense. We're looking at the left lateral view on this picture. Some structures we will start to talk about as we get a little bit further. And I'll just highlight them here. We have a pons, a medulla, and respectively, we've already talked about the spinal cord. So I'll just throw that out there right now. Pons and medulla. Very, very important components of the brainstem, also known as the hindbrain. Vital functions, breathing, blood pressure regulation, heart rate. Very, very important. This picture we're looking at here, I'll switch my color so you can see it a little bit better, is a superior view. So you're looking at the brain from a top down. We could see here that longitudinal fissure. We could see here that central sulcus, and respectively, our pre and post-central gyrus. This is the front. This is the back. So obviously we'll have our occipital lobe. You don't have to worry about all these arrows. They're just highlighting the various regions to kind of help you out a little bit, right? You don't have to worry about the letters that are on there and stuff. So looking from the top down, we can easily see that longitudinal fissure. This is probably one of the better pictures for that. And obviously, you should be familiar and be able to recognize these structures on all these model pictures. The thing I like about this picture, it's not too much going on, but we can see, and I'm sure if you've had your lecture, you've talked about it, we can see the difference between the cortex and the inner structures. So the cortex is going to be the outer region of the brain, right? That is made of gray matter. So the main thing I like to look at on here is that you can see the difference between the cell bodies, right? Here in the cortex, where the cell bodies of those neurons are found. And then we can see all these axons in the white matter underneath the cortex, right? Obviously, those are going to be running to a bunch of brain areas that we will discuss. And I will show you a couple of these other arrowed structures as we progress through the lab. Those are all superficial structures of the brain. Cool. Pretty basic. Remember them. Remember the sulci, the gyri, and the fissures, right? Here, we take a sagittal cross-section. We look inside the brain, right? You have this picture in your lecture. And I'm going to highlight some important structures that I want you to know that are internal. Right off the bat, there are some terms we've already mentioned. Pons, and we can see that here. The medulla oblongata, you can call it the medulla. That's that region right there. And obviously the spinal cord coming down. We have also talked about the cerebellum, which we can see here. And as with all these structures, it's composed of gray and white matter. The specific design or pattern, the specific structure of the white matter in the cerebellum has a name. And it is called, and all the new terms I'm going to highlight in a different color, is called the arbor vitae, right? Arbor vitae kind of looks like a plant, just the way it spreads out. Something we got to know. There's a lot of terms on here, but we're going to get through it. We already did the superficial. We'll do the deep ones. I'll show you where we can see these structures on some of the lab models. And from there, we will move on to different things. The first structure I want to highlight, and it's an easy one to recognize, is called the corpus callosum. Obviously, in lecture, we'll be talking about all these structures, but it's a pretty easy one to recognize, even on some of the gross anatomy, your real anatomy, right? It's this structure in the center of the brain. It's composed of specific fibers called commissural fibers. And that's kind of where the hemispheric separation stops, right? So it's a very thick structure we can see there. In addition, we can see the fornix. And I'll shade it in red here, and then we'll get rid of it. That fornix is a little structure underneath the corpus callosum, right? Some other really, really important structures to recognize in the brain is this guy here. And this is called, where is my arrow? I'll just highlight it here. You don't have to worry about all the specific parts of the thalamus. That's more for lecture. Here we go. That's the best place to see it. And that's called the thalamus. The thalamus is that central structure right in the middle. I'm kind of oval looking here. In reality, it's slightly different shaped. Very, very important for relaying sensory information. A lot of the sensory stuff we will be talking about will pass through that thalamus. Underneath the thalamus, I call it this little triangular structure, is called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is an extremely important structure. Pause this for 1 second. Let's see if I can fix this real quick. Had to take care of that noise real quick. Sorry about that. The hypothalamus is what we're going to be talking about for a couple lectures coming up. It's the bridge between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So it takes a lot of the complexities that happen in the brain and it turns it into a hormonal response. So you'll see the hypothalamus come up again. Um, in the endocrine system, very, very important. But for here, it is sitting underneath the thalamus. The next structure, also very, very, I mean, all these structures are extremely important, but this is a good guy. It's called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is in the brain, but it is also an endocrine gland. So it works with the hypothalamus, kind of under the influence of the hypothalamus in some situations, to release hormones. The hormone that comes from there is growth hormone. A lot of people are familiar with that, but that is the pituitary gland. Some other structures that are pretty important here, which I'll highlight for you in well, yeah, I'll keep the same color. Choroid plexus. And if you follow that arrow down, you will see that it is pointing to this squishy looking structure. It's kind of reddish on this picture. I'll get rid of my scribbles so you can see. But the choroid plexus produces the fluid that we've discussed before called cerebrospinal fluid. It is made of ependymal cells. It's very important. We'll talk about this a little bit in a couple slides. But that choroid plexus is sitting in structures called the ventricles that we will take a look at shortly. We have a little guy back here called the pineal gland. It is posterior, so it kind of looks like the pituitary gland, but keep in mind that pituitary gland, this is the front, right? This is our anterior view. And then this is the back, right? We're looking at a sagittal cross section from the side. The pineal gland is in the back. And it's responsible for circadian rhythm and sleep cycle and various hormones that we'll talk about. And the last-ish structure on this specific picture that I will highlight for you is an area called the midbrain. And this region right here is the midbrain region. The midbrain is composed of two structures we will discuss today. The first one is crazy name, corpora quadramina, right? Or quadramina, however you want to say it. And these are the two little bumps that sit back here. They have names. Everything has names. They're called the colliculi, the superior and inferior colliculi. But for now, that corpora, that is the generalized region. And another area of the midbrain, and the last structure we will talk about on this picture, is called the cerebral aqueduct. And what the cerebral aqueduct is this little tube right there that I highlighted. It's a component of the midbrain, and it allows cerebral spinal fluid to pass through, right? So we'll talk about all these ventricles and things, and this fluid has to drain out. In lecture, we'll probably talk about some conditions like hydrocephaly. Very, very important, as is all of this stuff. But again, both of those structures are a component of the midbrain. Now we'll look at some pictures and try to identify some of these structures, right? Obviously, you have your real anatomy. You'll check out pictures of the brain. You'll be familiar. We've talked about all these structures. I just put this up here because it's nice and labeled, so it helps you out looking at a different picture with some labeling. Obviously, you have access to it. On these models, we'll highlight the structures we discussed, right? This is your corpus callosum. This structure here is the fornix. This is your thalamus, hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland would be there on this specific model. It looks like it's there, but it's not, something else. You have your pineal gland. You have the cerebellum, pons, medulla, spinal cord, the midbrain region, right? Obviously, cerebral aqueduct and corpora quadramina. And you will notice as we transition in a little bit that there is some space in here. And there is some space here, and there is some space here, right? These spaces are called ventricles. So I'm not going to come back to this picture, so I just wanted to mention it. We have 4 different ventricles, as well as a couple other structures. And what is in these spaces is cerebral spinal fluid, CSF. It's extremely important. And we shall discuss it and the flow briefly. Obviously, in lecture, we go into a lot more detail. You can also see, like, some sulcus, some stuff like that. Not the best picture to see it. Obviously, I like looking at it from the outside. But these are some of the structures that we have discussed. On here, we can see the same structures, slightly different. I'll label them for you. We can see the corpus callosum, the fornix. On here, I'll point to it. We can see that choroid plexus. We can see the pineal gland. We can see that midbrain, cerebellum, obviously, pons, medulla, spinal cord, pituitary gland, not very good circle, pituitary gland. The thalamus is in this region. You can't see the hypothalamus very well here. Obviously, it is going to be located right there, but not the best picture. There you go. You will also see on here, because there's a skull intact, that we have some space. So I might come back to this picture when we start talking about flow of blood and cerebral spinal fluid. But that space has a name, as do these little dots. They're like they're reddish on the model, but they don't look that red. They kind of just look like black spots. Here, and here. And they have names as well. They're called arachnoid villi, and I'll discuss it in a few minutes. This picture is a little confusing. I get it. What we're looking at is the lower section of the brain from the back. The only thing I want to highlight on here, because I have a model for it, so I'll show it to you, are these colliculi. Slide this thing out of the way here. Those were part of that corpora quadramina, right? We can also see the pineal gland, and that makes sense because we're looking at the back, right? This is the view. We're looking at it from the back of kind of right above that brainstem region. And I will obviously you can see spinal cord and stuff like that as well. You can see part of the thalamus. Don't know why I did that. Let's see if I can fix that real quick. Probably clicked something. Probably coming too close to the top. You can see that thalamus. There's actually 2 thalamus. Both pictures I showed you so far kind of just show you cross section. But obviously, there's going to be an area on the right and the left, respectively. And I will show you on the next picture what I want you to recognize. Same view, same model, right? We can see that pineal gland here. We can see the superior and inferior colliculi. 2 separate bumps. We'll talk about their function in lecture. We can see our 2 thalamus. And that's primarily what I want you to take away from this picture. Right? You don't have to worry about all the other structures that are labeled on that previous one. Focus on those 4 main structures. Obviously, 2 superior and 2 inferior colliculi. And now we get into the ventricles. The ventricles are fluid-filled spaces found within the brain. The ventricles that I want you to take note of, in addition to some other structures, are our lateral ventricles, which we can see here to the side, And then there's another one behind it, a third ventricle. So there's two laterals times two. A third ventricle, which kind of sits by that thalamus region, and a fourth ventricle. Maybe I'll use some yellow on here so I can highlight it a little bit better. Third, laterals. And there's an important structure that's connecting the third to the fourth ventricle. And that is our cerebral aqueduct that we talked about before as being a component of the midbrain. We have already discussed the pons, the medulla, and the spinal cord. We have already discussed the cerebellum. And the cerebrum is obviously the entire big part of the upper brain, of the forebrain. So all we did was add in some spaces, fluid-filled spaces called ventricles, and obviously the cerebral aqueduct. And you can see on this picture, we'll talk about it more in lecture, the flow of the CSF. So that's all this is highlighting. Remember, we talked about the spinal cord and that central canal and the subarachnoid space, right? That's all this flow we're looking at down here through the spinal cord. We can see the ventricles. We can see the choroid plexuses. There are choroid plexus located in each ventricle. The choroid plexus is what's producing the CSF, and then it's draining out and circulating respectively. You will also see, yeah, we'll talk about that. You will also see these little structures, which I mentioned before, called arachnoid. Don't know why that keeps happening. Because I'm touching the top of the screen. That's probably why. Note to self, don't do that. The arachnoid villi, which we can see there, are all those little folds, bumps. They're going to be really, really important for draining the CSF, and we will discuss that in lecture as well. So those arachnoid villi, like I showed you on that previous model, are those little dots. Makes sense. Hopefully. These models are just showing you our lateral ventricles, like we showed before. The third ventricle, right? So these are the laterals. This is the third. This over here is our cerebral aqueduct. And then the fourth ventricle you can't really see, but it would be right there. I'll show you on the next picture. So this is just a model. It's like as if you filled up those spaces with, I don't know, gray plastic and then remove them. This model's showing us the ventricles. This is looking at that ventricle model from the posterior view. I like this because you can simply see the lateral ventricles, the third, the cerebral aqueduct, and the fourth ventricles. And you'll notice on here that there's some pink stuff. The pink stuff, which we're looking at right here and over here, that is the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexus, again, is those structures that produce cerebral spinal fluid. And thus, this entire model is just fluid circulating around, right? And obviously, we'll talk about CSF. On this picture, there's a couple important things I want you to take note of. This is looking at the brain from the bottom. These are other structures, right? Not the big lobes, not the internal structures. This is looking at it from the bottom. And some things I want you to know are olfactory bulbs, olfactory tracts. Obviously, these are involved in smelling because it's olfaction. They sit right above a specific structure in the skull. So when we inhale air, these little receptors in the olfactory bulbs can detect that and translate that into smell. We could clearly see the pituitary gland. We can also see, and I'll do this in a different color because it's a little bit confusing. We're going to get into special senses in one of the upcoming labs. But for here, you can see there's this little X-like structure, right? This has to do with vision. So number one, the thing coming off the front, it will obviously go to your eyeballs. This is called the optic nerve, right? We had within the olfactory bulbs and tract, we had an olfactory nerve. You will see as you look through that these are all numbered. They are cranial nerves. There are 12. Unlike the previously discussed spinal nerves, which branch off the spine, and we named them all, I think, in the last lab, these branch off the brain. Hence, they're called cranial nerves. Our spinal nerves were mixed. They carried sensory and motor messages. These cranial nerves can be purely sensory, purely motor, or mixed. And we'll talk about these in lecture. Maybe you already have. So maybe they're familiar to you. Obviously, they have names. There's acronyms you can use to kind of remember them. But for here, I'm just highlighting a few of them, right? So we have the olfactory bulbs, the olfactory tracts, the pituitary gland, which we already labeled on a million different pictures. And then as we look backwards, the part sticking off the back is called the optic tract, right? There is a crisscrossing of those structures called the optic chiasm. It is not labeled here, but I can show it to you on a different picture. And that is just the crisscrossing. It's where those things meet, right? And then some pathways go off to the side and some of them crisscross for vision. But that's the gist of it, right? Obviously, you can see pons, medulla, spinal cord, things like that that we've already discussed, cerebellum, frontal lobe, temporal lobes, etc. But because we're going to be talking about special senses, I wanted to make sure I included this. You can see these structures on here, right? Olfactory bulbs, tracts, optic nerve, chiasm, tracts, etc. Right? As well as other structures we've already discussed. We can see them on here as well. This is just another picture for practice. And now we get to the brainstem. I've already talked you the parts. Pons, medulla, spinal cord, right? The pons is here. Obviously, in lecture, we're going to go through massive detail in these. We'll talk about them for a long time, or we probably already have. We can see the pineal gland. We can see that cerebral aqueduct on this picture specifically. We can see the cerebellum. We can see that arbor vitae, that pattern of white matter. And this is a pretty decent place to see that fourth ventricle. Not only can we see it on the other model, on all those pictures of the brain that were a sagittal cross-section, right in front of the cerebellum, there'll always be a little triangular space, and that is the fourth ventricle. This is from your real anatomy. Check it out. Everything's already labeled for you. Be familiar with this picture as well. Most of the stuff I'm going to ask you are off the model or a gross anatomy picture or a real anatomy picture. And eventually we'll get into a lot of histology. We'll talk about that. And the last lecture-y component of this is blood flow to the brain. So we have a variety of different blood vessels. The main blood vessels I want you to focus on are going to be your, let's see here, carotid artery. And we have a couple different branches, right? I don't have very good models, but I want you to know, hey, man, blood's coming up into the brain via a common carotid artery. We have two, one on the right and the left, respectively. And then this will branch off into an external and internal carotid, one of which goes inside, one of which goes towards the outside. And then we get into some substructures inside the brain, and that's what I'm going to highlight for you. So when we look inside the brain, we have a little circular, that's probably not the best color. We have a little circular structure here we will call the circle of Willis, and I'll show you on the next two slides. We have a basilar artery, which is right here, and we have two internal carotid arteries, and those are the main ones I want you to focus on. Really, if you look at a picture of the blood vessels in the brain, we can just call it the circle of Willis. And we can see this in a little bit more detail here. Probably already talked about it in lecture. But this is the model that we have for the circle of Willis. These are internal carotids. The circle of Willis would be sitting right there. And that's the gist. I think in our gross anatomy, we have a pretty good picture of the circle of Willis as well. I'll highlight a little bit of what we're looking at here, kind of what we can see. Obviously, you've learned the majority of structures of the brain, right? That was the main part of the lab. However, we do have some gross anatomy pictures and things of that nature. This is, just like we had meninges in the spinal cord, we have them in the brain as well. This is the dura mater, and that's the only thing I want you to recognize on this slide. It's a tough cover. It's obviously the outermost meningeal layer. And then you can see once you remove that dura mater, you can see brain tissue, right? So on here, the main thing I want you to focus on is this is a posterior view. Looking at the back. This is the cerebellum. This is your occipital lobe. That is your parietal lobe. You can also see that we have separation here. That'd be the longitudinal fissure, as well as the transverse or transverse cerebral fissure. And the reason I highlight this is I often ask people what this thing is here. And they say it's the occipital lobe, but it cannot be because it's completely disconnected from the upper portion of the brain. So that would be the cerebellum, right? So a couple different structures you should be able to recognize on this picture. This is just a superior view. Main thing we're looking at on here, besides that longitudinal fissure, right? You could see the central sulcus, pre-post central gyrus, is that we have blue blood vessels. These blue blood vessels are called cerebral veins. They're just veins found in the brain. Main thing on here I like is that longitudinal fissure. And besides arteries that we discussed, you also have veins in the brain. On here, the main thing we can see is the gray versus the white matter. Not the most high resolution picture, but you can see a few things. Your real anatomy pictures are better. Olfactory bulbs, tracts, that's that optic chiasm. This is the spinal cord, pons, medulla, cerebellum, right? Again, I have better pictures, but you can recognize the structures on here as well. Just a lateral view of the brain, right? We can recognize structures like the corpus callosum, the fornix. Now we know that the lateral ventricles will be in that region. You can also see the thalamus and hypothalamus, pons, medulla, cerebellum, and that's really all you could see on here, right? Just recognize the big main structures in case I ask you on a picture. Can't see too much on here. That's okay. Obviously, it's cadaver. It's a little bit blurry, but you can see the difference between the brain, spinal cord, and pons. And you can kind of see that corpus callosum in there a little bit. This is a gross anatomy picture of the circle of Willis. That's really all I want you to know about that. Obviously, cerebral arteries. And now we get into some specific types of imaging, right? Each one is labeled for you. There's differences and there's different types of pictures and there's different reasons we would use all this stuff. I'll probably have highlighted that in the lecture already. But this is called a PET scan, as is this one, right? Just specific types of imaging. I don't want to go into too much of the lecture here. Just recognize the pictures for lab. This is an MRI, and there's a bunch of different types of MRIs and stuff. Obviously, we need some of these highly specialized tests to see the soft tissue of the brain. It's covered by a skull, and sometimes we need to see some of these internal structures as well. Is the MRI specifically showing some blood flow and things? And this is cool. There's specialized test called angiographies. An angiography is a type of test that allows you to see blood flow, specific blood vessels. We use them a lot for the heart, but this one is a cerebral angiography. So it's highlighting the blood vessels of the brain. Maybe somebody has an issue, maybe there's intracranial bleeding, or one of the things we're going to see called an aneurysm. And they would need to identify where that bleeding was or what blood vessels were ruptured. This is a CT scan, so referred to as CAT scan. And obviously, it's kind of an old one, but there's much higher resolution ones now. And we have a specialized electrical test called an EEG, an electroencephalogram. And there are a variety of different waves that it can detect. And those waves are highlighted here, right? Obviously, you put electrodes all over the brain. And I'm sure in lecture we've already talked about alpha, beta, theta, and delta waves. But each type of wave represents some type of brain activity that would specifically be detected by an EEG. Here we have something called an arteriovenous malformation, also known as an AVM. And it's a vascular issue where you have basically pore formation of capillaries. This is what it would look like in the brain. You can see this region here. Abbreviating it is totally fine. An AVM. We have the recognition of tumors. So you can see here, normal brain, that's a tumor. So we would use some of these specialized imaging techniques to recognize a variety of issues that may arise. In this case, you have abnormal cell growth, and there's not that much space in the skull. So this could cause a pretty serious problem, cause compression of other areas, affect blood flow, etc. We have something called the hematoma, which is some pretty serious internal bleeding. And in this picture, you can recognize the specific hematoma. You can see all that blood flow kind of building up and pooling. You can see that it's in the ventricles. Clearly no good. They would, maybe drill holes in the skull to alleviate the pressure, let some of that blood drain out, as well as a slew of other things to remediate the problem. And one of the last ones is an aneurysm. An aneurysm, here you can see a normal blood vessel, but here we have this stretching and ballooning of that blood vessel. The problem with an aneurysm is it can rupture, right? Obviously, if that was an artery and that ruptured, you would be leaking blood out all over the place, possibly developing hematoma or other issues. So that's called an aneurysm. And to finish up, and you don't have to stress too much about the cranial nerves. Like I said, we talked about that in lecture. I won't make you recognize them. I know in the real anatomy homework, you do have to go through and do it, but as far as me testing, I will not ask you. So you can remember that. But the rest of the slides, I don't even need to go through. They're posted for you. And if you look at it, let's see, go all the way to the bottom for you. if it lets me. All of these slides are labeled. You have gross anatomy pictures of the brain. Everything's labeled for you, right? Try to focus, obviously, on the words that I talked about. Images like this, although you may see in Real Anatomy, I will probably not use for your test. I like stuff that's kind of clear. That's obviously a very clear picture. We can see the cerebral aqueduct here, right? That's a frontal cross section. We have pictures like this where you're transversely looking in and down. We can see the ventricles, stuff like that. You should be familiar with them. So all these pictures are labeled for you. All these structures we've talked about. Here you have highlighting of the pre, versus, post central gyrus. Obviously, we talked about a little bit more in lecture. So those are all for you to practice. And what I want you to do, be able to recognize basic structures from the superficial view of the brain, your various lobes, sulci, things like that. You should be able to recognize some internal structures. In lab, I'm not going to ask you the function of them, but you should be able to recognize those structures, as well as some of the imaging. Obviously, ventricles, probably circle of Willis, maybe that'll be on there. And practice your real anatomy. Other than that, that concludes lab 4 of the brain. The next lab we're going to be doing is nervous system pathways. It looks like a lot, but it's not that bad. So see you in the next one.